afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon session here. This afternoon, we're going to have a lovely panel discussion where we're going to start looking at the circular plastic economy in South Africa and really ask the question, is biodegradable plastic the answer? So I think everyone will agree that plastic has really become a central part of our lives. I don't think there is an hour or even a moment that goes by where we don't have not been influenced or touched by plastic in some way or form. So plastic really has made our lives really, really convenient. But the problem lies in the mismanagement of the plastic, specifically in terms of environmental and economic impacts that plastic is having. So we're reminded of this daily. I think as we drive home and all the rest of it, we see litter on the side of the roads, or we are faced with illegal dumping at the end of our streets. And a lot of us have seen those photographs of the marine mammals being entangled and strangulated by plastic. So this afternoon, I am joined by five experts in the plastic sector. And we're going to explore the role of bioplastics in addressing the plastic issue here in South Africa. So I'd like to just take a moment to introduce everyone. Firstly, my name is Lauren Hayward. I'm a senior researcher here at the CSIR. I work in the Sustainability, Economics and Waste Research Group, and we are based in the Smart Places cluster. Joining us, we have Professor Suzanne Olofsheer, who is a principal researcher here at the CSIR, followed by Dr. Vincent Ojaji. Did I say that right? Ojijo, thank you. Vincent is the CSIR research group leader in the Advanced Polymer Composite. Next, we have Professor Rennie Schenk. She is the Saatchi Chair in Waste and Society at the University of the Western Cape. We have John Fox, who is the sales director at Enviromall. And then joining us virtually, we have Dr. Kirsten Barnes from SA Plastic Pact, and she's the project lead there, as well as an expert at Green Cape. I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you for joining us today. So before we start, I just want to highlight that the CSIR has been doing a lot of research in the plastic sector for a number of years. And as a result, we have built a considerable capability in this area. These capabilities really include technology and laboratory testing, unlocking high-value end-use markets through innovation, as well as application of modeling capabilities to inform product choice, as well as evidence-based strategy development. So we've got a little short video, little documentary that the CSIR has put together that highlights some of these capabilities, as well as some of the plastic issues that we are experiencing in the country. So I'm just going to give our panelists a chance just to move across so they're also able to see the video as they haven't seen it. And so just bear it. It's the next 15 minutes or so, or just have a look at this.
The issue of waste plastic is on the global agenda. We see it every day in terms of littering, illegal dumping. After the recent floods in KwaZulu-Natal, we saw it washed up on our beaches, in our rivers. We know that single-use plastic causes environmental and human health problems. And so globally, we're looking at how we address this problem. There have been competing views as to how we address this, depending on who the stakeholder is. So very often we'll see NGOs, lobby groups saying we need to ban single-use plastic. It's the only way to deal with this problem. We have industry saying this is a waste management problem. We can recycle our way out of the plastic pollution problem. And the thing is that these are competing views, and we've never reached a point to say, you know what, it's not any one of those. It's going to require a suite of interventions to solve the plastic problem. Single-use plastics do serve a purpose. We've seen this elsewhere in Africa, where we've had issues around water scarcity, or where there have been health issues attached to water, where bringing someone bottled water gives them access to a reliable water source. So we know that it serves a purpose. We've seen it during the COVID pandemic, the importance of having access to single-use plastics. Having said that, there are a lot of plastics which could be considered unnecessary, that don't need to be in the economy, that are perhaps not technically or economically recyclable. And so how do we phase out those problematic plastics? How do we eliminate the plastics that are not essential to our economy? How do we substitute materials where it makes sense to do that without unintended consequences and knock-on effects? How do we grow our waste collection and service delivery in South Africa to ensure that every South African has a regular waste collection service? How do we grow recycling and the local recycling market in South Africa to absorb that plastic that is being collected?
On the 26th of July 2019, the contract between the Japanese government and UNEDO was signed here at the CSIR, and we then started with a project shortly after, looking at South Africa's sustainable transitioning from conventional plastics to more sustainable alternatives. The study had two main outputs. The one was an action plan for South Africa's transitioning to alternative materials, and the other output was around capacity building and assisting recycling, specifically also developing capacity building materials for waste picker integration, so that when we transition to alternative materials, that the waste pickers are also aware of what materials can be recycled and what others is biodegradable. And the main findings from this study was then looking at what materials can be transitioned or alternatives can be used, and there we identified about 17 different materials. Then we also went on and did a life cycle sustainability assessment, and that study was done specifically for polystyrene takeaway containers and the cup. And the results of that study actually indicated that from an environmental life cycle assessment perspective, that the polystyrene containers are the better option, but when you look at persistence in the environment and pollution, then polystyrene is 400 times worse than any biodegradable alternative. Part of the project was then also to pilot test alternative materials to see if indeed they can be used as drop-ins or to replace the polystyrene containers. And there the chemicals cluster here at the CSIR did some tests, and it became apparent that some of the materials are very well suited to replace the injection molded alternative materials, and there's also others that can be used just as films, but the biodegradable alternatives are definitely an option, and our study also indicated that there is potential for localization of the production of some of these materials, but there are some issues that first needs to be resolved. And one of the big issues that we are concerned about is that we already see an influx of some of the biodegradable materials being imported into South Africa and finding its way into the waste stream. But our current end-of-life management of those materials are not in place, because many of those materials require industrial grade composting, and currently those are in short supply in South Africa. And that's also where it's nice to now have the biodegradation lab, where we can actually test to verify if the claims of biodegradability is in fact legitimate, because we also see a lot of greenwashing happening in this whole biodegradable space.
We can't necessarily always plug and play solutions from elsewhere to address this problem in South Africa. So we've got a very important role in terms of evidencing to make sure that the decisions that we are taking are the right decisions, that they help to support the economy, that they help to support South African citizens, and that they don't have the unintended environmental and human health impacts. There are some innovative projects happening in this space, whether it be waste plastic in road construction or into alternative materials that can be used in industry. This helps to create the demand, it helps to increase the prices for waste plastic that is paid, and ultimately, as one of those solutions, helps to address the plastic waste problem.
As we all know, the biodegradable materials can replace certain conventional plastics. Not all of them, so we have to be quite careful on what products we are targeting. And for our group, the focus has been on those products that cannot be recycled, that are typically used, have a single lifetime, and then they're thrown away. And examples here include things like in the agricultural industry, the mulch films. Once the farmer has finished with the mulching process and the crop is done, they have to take out these mulches at their own cost and try and dispose of them. But in practice, some of them don't even dispose. some of them end up burning these plastics, which again creates pollution to the environment. And again, when you keep them on the farms for long, what happens is they tend to disintegrate into what we call microplastics that have been shown to interfere even with the soil structure and hence the productivity of the crops. So what we do as CSIR in my group is to develop alternative biodegradable mulch films, and this project has been sponsored by the UK government through their FCDO, that's the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, to develop and showcase and do some field trials for biodegradable mulch films. And the approach we are taking there is to try and use locally available materials, and in this case starches, and preferably starches from waste materials, to try and modify commercially available bioplastics so that we can tailor the service life of these mulches. And the reason why we need the tailoring is because you have different crops with different life cycles. So you'd want a solution for the different crops with these different life cycles. So what we do is to engineer our materials so that they can last the crop life cycle. But once it's done, then the farmer can bury this in the soil, and they don't have to worry about the cost of removal. They don't have to worry about burning this material, which pollutes the environment further. So it's a solution that's elegant, very appropriate for bioplastics. So these are typical examples where bioplastics have a place in the circular economy.
In this particular instance, we are trying to use non-recycled plastic wastes so that we can find a new end market for it, and we're utilizing it in the form of pellets. And this third case study here at Engineering 4.0 is basically focusing on the use of those pellets, those plastic waste pellets, through what we refer to as the wet method of using plastic waste in the asphalt layer, which is the topmost layer that you are seeing here, just to see how well will it work. Consistency is key, and you also have to align the plastic wastes that you select to the properties of the road eventually, and that's how you're able to select one plastic type from another plastic waste type. Okay? What we found to be the key benefit of using plastic waste in roads is rutting resistance. You can use it for rutting resistance application due to traffic and at very high temperatures. So we found that the addition of plastic waste can reduce those rutting effects.
The other role that we have to play as well is really to make sure that we inform the policy landscape as well, that the right policies are being put in place, the right legislation is being put in place to give effect to these solutions. And then finally, through the work that we're doing with the Department of Science and Innovation, is to help to grow the end-use market for waste plastics, to identify innovative new solutions of what we can do with waste plastic, to help to grow the pull and the demand for plastic at end of life.
I think that was a very interesting video that the CSIR put together. So my immediate thought when I think about plastic, I think about single-use plastic, packaging plastic. This video has definitely shown me that there's definitely a lot more applications to plastics than originally thought, and that a lot of that plastic is destined to end up in the environment. I mean, so now we need to really think about this and think about when we are starting to look at plastic and looking at the problems associated with plastic, when we start looking about entering into the circular economy and starting to look at different solutions such as biodegradable plastic, we really need to put this into context of the actual application of the plastic. And secondly, we need to really look at evidence-based I want to say solutions and see whether these actually, and the evidence that comes about is actually solving the problem. We don't want to have plastic solutions that actually lead to unintended consequences. So having said that, I'm going to move on to you, Suzanne. The CSIR has been involved in a number, or have completed 2 really important projects lately. The first one has been with the Department of Science and Innovation, looking at the different intervention levers that can be applied to stop leakage of plastic into the environment. And the second project was what we did for the World Bank on creating a circular economy in South Africa. Could you maybe give us some of the key take-home messages from these projects, these studies, when it comes to the important improved management of waste in South Africa?
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, let me start with the World Bank project, where we specifically looked at the circular plastics economy in South Africa. There we found, first of all, that we need a common vision and roadmap to ensure a coordinated effort when we start looking at a circular economy in South Africa. There's a lot of projects currently undertaken by different entities, but we are not all pulling in the same direction. And I think that's where the main issue lies. And we've also identified that we actually need a single entity, be it a department or a committee, that can take the lead. So at least that there is somebody leading the circular plastics economy in South Africa. Then we also identified that we need an enabling environment for a circular economy. Currently, our legislation around waste actually makes it very difficult to look at circularity when it comes to plastics and also other materials. We also need to start looking at designing out unnecessary and problematic plastics, and therefore we need clear definitions of those materials. We also need to design things for circularity to ensure that at end of life, the materials can be retained in the economy. Then we also need to look at scaling up of reuse models. We know that a lot of plastics are actually reusable, even though it may be manufactured as a single-use product. So therefore, we need to ensure that we can look at those reuse models. Then also we have to find and drive demand for post-consumer recyclate. If we don't do that, we end up with a lot of plastics that's being recycled, but no end market for those products. Then an important one is we need behavior change in South Africa. It doesn't help we talk about a circular economy, but people still tend to just throw plastics any place in the environment. We need to eliminate leakage, making sure that the plastics at end of life finds its way back into the waste streams to where it can be properly managed, and then promote inclusivity and just transition to a circular economy. In line with other governmental imperatives. So that is then, in summary, what we found in the World Bank project. And there's a number of interventions under each of these that I've listed. Then the other study that we've done that Lauren referred to was testing the Pathways tool that was developed by the Pew Charitable Trust in collaboration with Oxford University, to estimate the leakage of plastics into the environment from South Africa, specifically using our local data. And the findings from that study clearly indicated that there is no one silver bullet that will get us to where we need to be to reduce plastics. We need a combined strategy, which require reducing plastic consumption, increasing collection and recycling of all recyclable plastics, materials, and properly disposal of plastics in sanitary landfills. We have a lot of landfills in South Africa currently that are not considered sanitary landfills. So even though the waste finds its way into landfill, it still sometimes leaks into the environment, and that needs to be addressed. So we can, in summary, then say that we need strategic interventions specifically to reduce plastic demand, and that will require more reuse of plastics, also new delivery models of materials, and also looking at products as services rather than just as products. Also to eliminate and substitute with alternative materials. And here specifically, we've already seen a lot of alternative materials entering the market, especially the biodegradable and compostable materials. But there is a big caution from our side that we must be very careful about ad hoc introduction of alternative materials. Because simply the fact that introduction of alternative materials, while we still have the conventional plastics as for the same applications may result in disruptions of our current recycling systems. And we cannot allow that. And we must also make sure that we do have the correct end-of-life treatment for these materials in place. Then the management interventions that we've identified look at improving waste collection, and here specifically addressing the backlogs, but also introducing waste separation at source to ensure that all plastics, irrespective of whether they are widely recycled or not, does enter the recycling stream, so that even where there is no current recycling happening, that we can find solutions for those materials. And then also the improvement of landfills, where we specifically look at compliance with legislation. So it's around also enforcement to make sure that the plastics that enter the waste stream and landfills are indeed contained. And then lastly, just to make sure that our interventions are indeed a collaborative approach, because this is not something that any person or organization can do on its own. We need collaborative actions between all stakeholders and a commitment to support the necessary changes across the entire plastics value chain with immediate action. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Suzanne. I think from that we can see there's definitely a lot of interventions that have been put on the cards, as well as a number of solutions. Now it's how do we get those solutions to actually work? Kirsten, I'm going to move over to you, and I hope that you can hear us and that we'll be able to hear you. The South African Plastic Pact has developed a roadmap to 2025. So my question is, what is the Pact's strategy to deal with plastic and the plastic problems in South Africa in order to drive a greater circularity? And also, is there a role for biodegradable plastics in that strategy?
Thanks so much, Lauren, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person with your esteemed panel. I'm seriously missing out here, although it is a beautiful day in Cape Town. I have to just add that in. So thanks so much. So completely agree with one of Suzanne's last comments around the collaborative space. And in fact, there's many elements that Suzanne has mentioned that I will elaborate on in terms of the South African Plastics Pact and our approach. So our overarching strategy as a Plastics Pact, and as Greencape, we're the Secretariat for the Plastics Pact, and the membership are the heart and soul of the Pact. And together we want to drive plastics, keeping our plastics in the economy and out of the environment, and out of landfills specifically as well. And to do that as a Secretariat, we convene across the plastics value chain. So our members include a resin producer, a packaging manufacturer, big brand owners and retailers, collectors, specifically our reclaimers are very key partners, and our recyclers, as well as key supporting members. So together, as a collective, as a collaborative, we commit to bold targets. And what that looks like is working both on the upstream, so some of the design elements that Suzanne has mentioned, as well as on the downstream. So if we look at on the upstream, what our roadmap will unpack in a very high level way is our strategy to approach that. And we look at design first and foremost. So we look to design out unnecessary plastics, as well as those problematic plastics which have a very low potential to be circulated in our economy. And then we also have a big focus on designing for reuse. And that looks like a business model design. So that's rethinking the way we deliver product. And it can also look like a reusable packaging design. And then also a strong focus on design for high value recyclability. And when we talk recyclable, we talk in practice and at scale. Often we hear recyclability used where it only means a technical recyclability. And if you throw enough money at something, anything is in theory technically recyclable. We also want to aim at a high value recyclable. So what we mean by that is we're not just looking at recycling for one additional lifetime. We're looking for recycling for that material over multiple lifetimes. So I think that's quite a key concept that we work on as an SA Plastics Pact. So you can see in that upstream element that we're rethinking what plastics we're using. And we do have a focus on plastic packaging as a pact. And we're thinking about the way we use that in its serviceable life for that particular aspect, whether in a reuse model or whether as a single-use packaging. And then we're looking at the supply to our recycling economy. And a recycling economy is an element of a circular economy. It's not the full circular economy itself. And I think that's quite key to mention. And then on the demand side, so our PACT members have recognized that in terms of driving our recycling economy, they themselves are part of the solution. So they can specify recycled content in their packaging. And by doing that, they increase the value of plastic packaging end of life so that that material can go back into a new packaging. It can go back into new packaging. So there's recycled content in new packaging. So we're creating that demand at the same time, because without the demand, we're not going to pull supply. We're not going to pull those plastics through our economy, and we're not going to be able to retain them. So I think we work across the value chain. We work collaboratively and convene. So all our members bring their insights and perspectives and their resources from their different segments of the value chain. And together we're able to design something which looks far more circular. Then going to the question around biodegradable plastics and do they have a role? I think first, before we get into any specifics there, we need to address some of the confusion in terminology and the confusion in claims. And I think that's something that we'll get into in a little bit more detail in this discussion. But just to highlight what we see is two almost mainstreams in terms of biodegradable materials claimed on the market. The one is where the material in itself is biodegradable, and the other is where there's biodegradation additives, generally added to traditional polymer plastics. So here, as a PACT, we're mostly dealing with packaging. If we look at the biodegradable materials, biodegradation or biodegradable materials, and we are very excited about the lab at the CSIR to verify this in South Africa, it means breakdown to naturally occurring components within the natural environment. But that might take a certain time scale. So you might still get some of the macro pollution effects or the negative impacts of a macro biodegradable material in terms of being eaten by bird life, etc., because there's quite a long time scale of biodegradation. We would emphasize compostability as a PACT, and that looks like, and we do emphasize, again, Suzanne mentioned, a home compostability, because that's what we're likely to see in our context. It's more likely to be home composting. So that looks like it won't be an in-vessel composting. There won't be a great degree of temperature control, control of oxygen levels, that sort of thing. So we'd look at a home compostability, and that must break down under relatively short timescales to be suitable for home composting. And I think that's quite a key element. We also then, with the biodegradable additives, we're quite concerned there's been a proliferation of these, and particularly touted in our sort of context, where in low to middle income countries, you have a high potential for leakage, and saying, well, if there's a high potential for leakage, let's just make sure that this material breaks down quicker. Generally, what this means is that we just form microplastics quicker. So we just accelerate the formation of microplastics. Obviously, microplastics are more difficult to mitigate in the environment. Some biodegradability additives added to those traditional polymers do claim to biodegrade to naturally occurring components. But another concern we have around those additives is, one, they're often not identified well on the packaging. So they'll enter so if it's an additive in PET or HDPE, they'll enter recycled mechanically in South Africa, are well recycled. What does it mean for that additive to be in that stream in the recycling plant? Those additives will be activated under certain conditions, such as high UV, some sort of aspect like that. So what does that mean if that additive is activated? It can also be a time scale component, so sufficient to get a product to a consumer to be consumed. So that sort of element. So we're quite concerned about that. We need to watch out for that. So, sorry, Lauren, long story short, what we get to is in a PACT, we emphasize home compostability if there is an analysis of the switch to that packaging material in terms of feasibility, and there are other elements to consider there. And also we emphasize, again, as Suzanne mentioned, we need to be careful on where we put these packaging types. If it's in a format and with a sort of replacing a polymer type which is highly collected and recycled in South Africa, the potential for disruption of our mechanical recycling is big. and then we're taking steps backwards. So products that are not currently well recycled would be something that should be considered. So we need to look at these alternatives, but the system that you place it in is key. I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, thank you very much for giving us a in-depth understanding of actually what biodegradable plastics are. I think that's really important, and it leads us on to our next question, which I want to ask Vincent here. We saw in the video that there was much emphasis on plastics in the agriculture sector, which by their very design ends up in the land. So it would make sense for that plastic to be transitioned or transformed into biodegradable plastics, specifically around the mulch that we've seen, or even the plastic coated fertilizers or the seeds. So my question is do you have a sense of how big the agricultural plastic market is in South Africa, and which agricultural plastics make sense for transitioning to biodegradable alternatives? And is there a willingness for the sector to transition these products in South Africa? So there's 3 questions for you there, Vincent, please.
Thanks, Lauren. To take on the first question that you asked about the market size and opportunity for biodegradables in South Africa, yes, away from packaging, we see that plastics are also being applied in other areas like agriculture that are typically not often in our eyes. So we do not see the pollution as much as we would see in packaging, in marine littering and all that. So in the agricultural sector in South Africa, currently from Plastic SA, I think the latest statistics showed that about 9% of the about 1.7 million plastics converted end up in agricultural use. And on this, we have different categories of product lines that they're used in. Example is the mulch film that I'll just speak about just right now. We have silage wraps. We have things like irrigation systems, and some of these products, they really help us to meet some of the SDGs in terms of minimization of the water use in agriculture. If you look at the irrigation system, if you look at the mulches, in terms of trying to conserve the evaporation, loss of water, and all that. So there are products even within the agricultural sector that are destined for longer use, and therefore we should not put it to biodegradable alternatives. Like the previous speakers have said, we have to be quite careful on which products we choose for replacement. And an example would be what has been shown already, which is the mulches, which is the mulch film. And I'll just give an example of, or an explanation of why we think this is a suitable alternative or a suitable product that could be, changed or could ripe for changing or conversion to bioplastics. So typically for the mulches, we know the benefits of the mulch films, and there are so many. I've mentioned some of them in terms of conserving water in the agriculture. They help to control the weed growth, especially if they're black. So, you even reduce the cost for herbicide and things like that. And at the same time, when you put all these things together, they tend to help with the crop yield or the productivity of the farmer. So there are benefits. But then for the conventional plastics, what happens when they lie on the farms for long and due to exposure to the environment, the UV, the sun, and all that, they tends to degrade into microplastics that previous speakers have spoken about. And these microplastics have been shown to interfere even now in the long run with the crop productivity. So there would be accumulation, they will interfere with the soil structure, and in the long run, the cost of these negative externalities basically outweigh the benefits that you had from the beginning. And at the end of the crop growing, the farmer has to think of, what do I do with this? They have to take them out of the farm, and they're meant to be, if they're designed for recycling, they're meant to be recycled. But again, if you look at the mulch films, the ratio between the film itself and the contamination is about 2 to 1, which means 2 parts of the film to 1 part of the soil and other contaminants like crop residue. So it makes it uneconomical to recycle. So even though it was designed and has the right thickness for recycling, it becomes uneconomical to recycle. So what farmers typically do is burn these things on the farms, which again lead to further pollution of the environment. Now, this gives you, a picture of one of those products that you can then replace with bioplastics because, biodegradable polymers, because then this, after growing plant or the plant season, then the farmer can bury this in the soil, and it needs to have full biodegradability into the elements that my fellow panelists talked about. So it needs to be converted to, it basically needs to be mineralized to CO2, water, and biomass. So it has to be full biodegradability, and it also needs to, you have to make sure that it does not leave any adverse residue that would interfere with the crop growing. So that is a very good example of, one of the products within the agricultural space that can be replaced with biodegradable plastics. The other one, what Lauren spoke about, is the fertilizer coating. So we have applications of these polymers. They're used for coating fertilizers to control the release rate. And this is very beneficial for the crops because then it releases the fertilizers at a controlled rate that the crop is able to take. So it means you do not lose a lot of fertilizer due to leaching. So they are beneficial. The downside to that is these recalcitrant polymers also tend to break down into microplastics that I've just said that have very adverse effect in the long run. So in the short space, you may not see this, but cumulatively, they will affect your productivity in the long run. So this is also another example of where this product cannot be recycled because you cannot retrieve it from the soil. So it makes a lot of sense then to replace this with a biodegradable alternative, which means you're applying the redesign thinking within the circular economy to get a material that would be able to biodegrade at the end of its useful life cycle. And then on to the next question, which was on whether there is an appetite for this or not. In the project that was shown in the video that is sponsored by the FCDO, that's the UK government, FCDO, through their Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Program, we did some initial studies where we went across South Africa, spoke with different stakeholders, farmers and manufacturers on the acceptability of this alternative solution. And the answer to that was yes, there is, they want to adopt the solution, but obviously there is always a but, especially when it comes to the cost. And what I mean by the cost here is the face value cost at the moment. Because if you look at the economic system that we have at the moment, our polymers, the conventional plastics, for instance, do not take into account the cost of external, negative externalities. What's the effect to the environment? Who's paying for this? What's the effect to, our lives and all that? Who's paying for this? And how is this incorporated in the cost structure? At the moment, we do not have that. So the EPR scheme, I think, tries to address that to an extent. But then for these bioplastics, then they would appear at face value that they are costly. And that's something obviously that has to be addressed. And one of the opportunities that the farmers and some of the stakeholders we spoke to highlighted was for the farmers who are exporting the products, especially to the EU region, there are instances where now, those export markets are telling them that you have to adopt sustainable agricultural practices. And that includes using, sustainable materials in your production. Example is your biodegradable mulch films, and without which you're not going to be able to access those markets. So those are low-hanging sort of business opportunities that they could tap into through the adoption of these alternative biodegradable materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. I think you gave us a really in-depth understanding of what's happening in the biodegradable space in agriculture. And what I really liked you talking about was, the redesigning aspect of it. So looking at plastics differently, how do you redesign to be fully biodegradable? Sounds like a really hopeful solution to some of our plastic issues. I want to now move over to Rennie. I think Rennie has some very, very, very interesting research that she's been doing. And so basically leading up to this, historically, the types of waste we used to see in the rural areas was typically waste that could kind of be dealt with. So there was opportunities to reuse a lot of the waste items, such as glass bottles, or even to make use of the food waste and compost it. But things have changed a lot, and now we're seeing that in the rural areas, the waste actually is very, very similar now to the waste that we see in urban areas. But the difference between the two is that really the urban areas are not really able to address their waste management to the level and the scale that bigger cities can. So as a result, the issues that have emerged which face these rural municipalities is the dumping of used nappies in the open spaces, which then enter into our rivers, into other different aspects of the environment. So Rennie, I'm really interested to hear about how big this problem really is and how do we go about solving this problem going forward.
Thank you. I think the thing that come to my mind is there's a saying, no good deed goes unpunished. And I think with nappies, that's exactly the problem, because I think a wonderful product that was developed to make mothers and parents' lives convenient became one of our biggest problems that we have at the moment. So, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about what's happening in rural areas. I think this is a major issue. So currently, maybe just to give you a little bit of a figure, at the moment the estimate is that in South Africa, we are generating 700,000 tons of disposable diapers and AHP products per year. Now, our collection rate of waste that Suzanne was referring to is 69.6%. So around 30% of waste is not collected. So if you work that out, it means that over 200,000 tons of nappies or HB products have to be discarded in the fields and in the rivers of South Africa. And I think if we can take that number into a picture, try just to picture 200,000 tons of nappies, and then it becomes a massive problem. So our research in the rural areas has shown that, because as you were saying, that many of the products the communities can manage. They can manage the glass, they can manage the plastics, they either burn it or they can reuse it or they can bury it. But a nappy is something that you can't do that. You can't burn him, you can't bury him, you can't reuse him. So it is literally thrown into the rivers as the only option that the communities think it can be managed. And I think this is the big problem. And we've seen it in all the places where we have done the research, that the community will take us to the places where they dump it and where it is dumped, either in open spaces, but most of the time it is in the rivers, because then it's washed away. And it is the major rivers that are going through the Kruger National Park. It's the major rivers that are actually the source for the communities, the water source for the communities. And I think what is important is that we have to realize that these rural communities doesn't have, in many ways, maybe not electricity, not other infrastructure is also very weak, and there's no collection at all of the nappies. So it is really a big problem for the communities. So we have tried to, so then I think to get to the thing, what is the answer? That is the $1 million question, and there's no silver bullet. I think the main problem that we have at the moment is that the municipalities are not collecting the waste. So the only answer at the moment is it should be collected, either to go to the landfills, which is not the ideal, but this is what's happening in South Africa. Waste is nappies are collected into the so we don't have any other options at the moment. There's not anything done in terms of pyrolysis or waste to energy. There's a major project undergo that the Department of DFFE is looking into what can be done with the nappies and if there's anything else. But the collection system is something that needs to be developed, because we are struggling with sorting at source for dry waste and wet waste. So if you want to collect this for something, it has to be another level of collection. So we will have to have a third bag in terms of the collection. But I think what is very important, many people will say, the first thing they would say to me is, why don't they use cloth nappies? That's not an easy answer. Because if you work in some of these areas, there's not proper water, there's not electricity. So what will they wash the water with? Many of the communities have water being trucked in by the municipality or by somebody else, so they can't do that. We have spoken to the communities as well. One of the members was saying to us, not in this generation will we go back to cloth nappies, because I think it's a convenient factor. It saves, they believe it saves time, it saves water, it saves electricity. So in many aspects, they find that it's a cheaper option, if I can say that in brackets. And then there's, of course, also they developed a social stigma around using cloth nappies in various ways. So I think in the end, to make it more complex, whatever we're going to decide, we will have to sit and collaborate, what Suzanne was also referring to. We will have to collaborate with the communities, work out solutions, how it can be done, how it can be managed. I think that one of the main aspects that I find is that there's no communication about the nappies. We don't talk to the communities how to manage the nappies. It is something that the communities are sitting with, are dealing with, and they are trying to find their own way with this product that is actually unmanageable. And I think if we start those conversations with the communities and find out how it can be collected, how we can do it with the municipalities, maybe there's other ways of governing this monster. And I think that's maybe what I want to say.
Thanks, Rennie. Wow. Thank you. Those figures are astronomical and quite frightening. Being a mom myself, I know that I would never have used cloth nappies, and I was very dependent on the diapers. But it was very easy just to throw it in the dustbin and then the municipality collect them. So I think it must be a really horrible experience be living in those areas and being faced with diapers in your streets. I'm now going to move over to John. John, we've left you for last, basically just because I wanted to really engage with the other panelists on the different other aspects of plastics. But we're going to move over to you with regards to packaging plastic and how we're going to address that. So basically, we are seeing that more retailers and brand owners in South Africa are shifting to alternative packaging material. However, as much as this might sound like a good idea, there are also risks associated with this, in that some of the alternative materials may create other types of problems, like unintended consequences that we've already talked about, and we want to really be able to alleviate those unintended consequences. So you also are the current chair of the newly formed Compostable Packaging Council. So my question to you is, what role is the council playing to better manage and regulate the compostable packaging sector in South Africa? And where do you see the opportunities for biodegradable plastic packaging?
Thanks, Lauren. Firstly, I must agree with everybody. Compostable plastic is not the answer, but it's definitely 100% part of the solution. As our colleagues have all said, for us to get rid of this problem in front of us, we all need to be part of the solution, and compostable plastics is part of the solution. There was a recent study, and I think it's one of the studies that were mentioned early on, but by diverting or by changing substances and by using compostable, you've got the opportunity to divert as much as 17% from the plastics that are currently entering the ocean. So those are the kind of things that we should be looking at. What COPCO aims to do is to sort of look at standards. Currently, what happens is everything gets imported. I'm glad to see now we're starting to get things made locally. The CSR is doing some wonderful work. And hopefully South Africa will soon be the one that's exporting instead of having to import everything from everywhere. The problem comes with importing is that it comes from many different countries, and every country's got their own standard. And although they're very, very similar, everyone puts a different logo on it. And then we take that same logo and we put it on our goods and we say, hey, look at us. We've got this fantastic compostable product. The guy next to us is putting his hand up and say, look what I've got. And the poor consumer stands there and he looks, and there's so many different logos out there that they become confused. It also gives opportunities for people to start greenwashing and making their products look green. So you put a little circle with an arrow and a little green thing, make it green, and everybody says, oh, well, that must be good. when very, very often it's not. So that's also something that, we have to be aware of. So what COPCA has done in the interim is we trying to get a standard logo for all compostable plastics in South Africa, so the consumer can look at, can recognize it, and can see one particular logo. So what we've been doing is via independent auditors, they will then verify the product that it actually is what it says it is, because I have seen some very, very funny cases coming from overseas sometimes where they actually give you a false certificate. I've actually verified one, and I made the mistake once of actually not verifying it before taking it to a client, and he said, "Oh, this is nice," and then he verified it, and I had egg on my face, so I learned the hard way. So we make a point of using independent auditors, so we distance ourselves from it. They will then verify it, and you can see whether a product qualifies. So that's really what COPCA has been doing at the moment. So the opportunities that we're talking get very obvious, especially when we look at some of these studies that we mentioned. There's one recent study that just came out that says in the UK alone, 100 billion pieces of plastic are thrown away every year. And I don't think we realize just how much a billion is compared to a million. If you look at a million seconds, I think if I'm not mistaken, is about 11 days. But a billion seconds is something like 35 years. So the difference between a million and a billion is huge. So when we see some of our politicians squandering billions, now we know really how much it is. So we can relate it to the plastic. Plastic is also very, very difficult to recycle for many reasons. Not all plastics, but a lot of them are. Smaller pieces of plastics, for example. Plastics that are contaminated. Multi-layer plastics, for example. Those are all things that are really difficult. And if you go to any of these sites where the recycling is done, these mechanical sorting sites, and you have a look there, that stuff that we've put in our bags and we feel good about sending off because it's going to recycle. And you go there and you have a look and you'll see the majority of it just gets sent to landfill because there's no value in it, it's not recyclable, it's contaminated. So those are kind of what we need to be aware of. But then once we're aware of it, then we can start looking at opportunities. Plastic can't be recycled forever. It starts losing integrity, which means there's always going to be a demand for virgin plastic. Compostable plastics, on the other hand, can be recycled forever. Although we're talking about recycling it into compost, but technically it does get recycled. But I think we also mustn't underestimate the value of compost. I mean, our soil has been depleted of nutrients and microbes. We need to be putting compost back into the soil. So the more people that are doing home composting and putting stuff back into the soil is really important. However, what we do believe at COPCA is that compostable plastics do need to be in a closed loop situation. I think that is important. We all realize that. For you that were sitting and having lunch today, I'm sure you saw how much plastic and how much waste is going to landfill. Even I was scared when I saw the amount of plastic. All those containers that you looked at were lined with plastic in order to make it greaseproof. Now, if we could have a closed loop system where that was collected together with all the food waste and composted, can you imagine the difference? Humans are the only creature on the earth that creates waste. Did you know that? In nature, one organism's waste is a food source for the next one. But us humans, we special. We do things a little bit differently. Another really good example, and there's currently studies under the way, is to replace fishing nets with compostable. So what happens is a lot of the trawlers are losing their nets when they're out there fishing. And those nets, they call them ghost nets, float around for decades, probably for centuries, catching fish. those fish are just stuck there. They float around. So the amount of damage that's done is incredible. But replacing it with a compostable net means that, first of all, it's denser, so that if it does get lost at sea, it's going to sink to the bottom where less damage is going to be done. Secondly, when it does reach its end of life, it can be composted, and there's a lot of nutrients that have probably been caught up in that, so it makes a really good compost. So again, it creates a closed loop system, another really good use for compostable plastics. So that's what compostable plastics should be doing. They really should be where, in a closed loop system, and where they're replacing something that's not going to be recycled or is going to do a lot of damage. So that's really the point I want to try and make. There definitely is a place for compostable plastics, but it's got to be managed carefully. We don't want to put something into the recycling stream where it's going to contaminate or it's going to hamper proper recycling. Something like PT that's been really well recycled, we don't want to compete with that. And that's the view of COPCO.
Thank you, John. Wow, I think, can you please make sure that my local supermarket has compostable bags and that they are the right standards so that I can make sure that it gets composted? That'll be really great. It's something to look forward to in the future, but also to make sure that it is not greenwashed, like you say, and that we are actually getting a product that will be compostable. I would have loved to have got into another round of questions with these panelists because I think there's a lot more to ask and a lot more to explain. However, we have come to the end of our session, which was only an hour long. I also would have loved to have given everyone else an opportunity to have questions for our experts. However, should you want to engage with them, please come have a chat with them afterwards. But otherwise, I would like to thank everyone for your really valuable input. And yeah, I look forward to taking this conversation further, seeing where we're going to helping address South Africa's waste problems, or plastic waste problems, should I say, and creating a circular economy, and looking forward to seeing where we're going with biodegradable plastics. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for attending.